One of the problems with walking them into the WTO is that they got what's called developing nation status. You can either be a developing nation or a developed nation in the framework of the WTO. And maybe there was something legitimate to that in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping began his reforms, the average Chinese person was making $2 a day. By the year 2000, it was much more questionable, and it certainly makes no sense in the year 2025. And still to this day, China gets developing nation status. Now, what is the benefit to China of that? Well, they have a whole different set of rules. They're allowed to have tariffs. They're allowed to subsidize their industries. They have all sorts of different timetables for doing things. They're allowed to do things that the US simply can't do. Now, how have they leveraged that? They have identified strategically certain industries that are choke points in the global supply chain, and they have taken them over. And the best example of this is rare earths. So there was some good stories in the New York Times about this over the past couple of weeks, which I think were largely accurate. China identified this as a critical industry, and the rare earths, the ore itself is distributed all over the world. I mean, China has some advantages there, but they're not huge. It's the processing of the rare earths that's very expensive, very complicated, and they decide to dominate that industry. And they're responsible today for over 90% of the processing of rare earths. And then the next step in the supply chain is that those rare earths get cast into rare earth magnets, which are a critical component in pretty much every electric motor. And so they're a critical component of the automotive industry, but not just cars, lots of different products. And I think China makes something like over 90% of the cast rare earth magnets. Well, by the way, this issue still has not been resolved. China has now cut off the United States. And so as part of this trade negotiation, we're going to have to, resolve that issue. And I trust that it will be. I mean, what you've heard from the president and the Treasury Secretary over the past week is that they've indicated a desire to engage in bilateral negotiations with China and to essentially de-escalate this trade war. But I think it's been very useful, again, as a stress test to reveal our critical dependencies on China that we've exposed. We never should have let this happen. Just from a national security standpoint, we worshiped at the altar of this free trade god to the point where we became dependent on China for these critical components in our supply chain. I think that was a catastrophic mistake. And I think that it's exposed these dependencies we've created on a nation that is not our ally and that we can't count on them. It's a country of concern. So I ultimately think that we're going to need to learn from this experience and very rapidly make some major corrections here.